Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm glad to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the key issues concerning Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's first trip abroad and what to make of Canada's ongoing response to the Trump administration's provocations. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Oh, great to be with you again.
David, as I alluded, Prime Minister Carney traveled to the UK and France for his first official international trip. There was some surprise in Canada that he didn't first go to Washington. You think all of those choices are wrong. Where do you think he ought to have gone?
Yeah, look, what I'm about to say is a little challenging, and I understand the practical impediments, but I think the first trip should have been to Mexico City. The United States has always treated the North American trading relationship as two bilateral relationships.
Yes.
Got a bilateral relationship with Canada and a bilateral relationship with Mexico. And Canada has been willing to go along because Canadian governments have never been entirely sure they wanted Mexico in North America in the first place.
Yes.
They also want a bilateral relationship with the United States. But that was for the sunny days.
Yes.
Now these are stormy days. There is a three-way trading relationship. NAFTA before, now called USMCA or CUSMA, however you want to call the revision of NAFTA.
Yes.
Canada and Mexico are trading partners. The United States is muscling each of them in different ways. And both governments are looking for advantage against the other. Mexico is saying, look, throw Canada to the wolves. We want to preserve our deal. The Canadians are saying the same thing about Mexico. If you're going to constrain the Trump administration at all, it's going to be very effective or more effective or less ineffective if Canada and Mexico work out some joint positions.
This is a conversation, David, that you and I have had for the past several weeks, ever since President-elect Trump first raised the prospect of tariffs on Canada and Mexico. And I promise we'll come to what is, to some degree, a contrarian argument from you about the upside of leaning into our bilateral relationship with Mexico vis-a-vis the United States. But before we get there, I just ask if you'd help bring our listeners and viewers up to speed a bit on how the Mexican government has been responding to its own threats from the Trump administration of tariffs and other bilateral issues.
Well, Mexico, like Canada, is having a change of government. There's a relatively new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, the first female president in Mexican history. She was elected last summer. She took office on the 1st of October and was instantly confronted with the Trump challenge.
Yes.
President Sheinbaum's approach has been to talk very nationalistically in public, very tough in public, but in private to yield to the Americans just about every demand they have, especially on the border, especially on immigration enforcement, to take a much more military approach to the drug problem.
Yes.
The Mexican left, of which Sheinbaum is a part, has always opposed a military approach to the Mexican drug problem. She's said to the Americans, okay, I'm with you. I will support your military approach. What she's trying to do is preserve the access to the American market for the Mexican automobile industry.
Yes.
And she has in mind, and Mexican governments have in mind, taking more of the automobile industry from Canada, the parts the Americans don't want to keep for themselves, taking them from Canada and protecting Mexico's share at Canadian expense. And Canadian governments have played the same game, protecting Canadian industry at Mexican expense, and both of them looking at the other as who's going to be the least favored partner. But if we're going to keep the North American relationship working, Canada and Mexico are going to have to understand they're in a trilateral, not a pair of bilateral relationships. They're going to have to work out some common approaches and rules, because the essence of the Trump approach to trade is no rules, just what President Trump says goes. That's the law and the only law.
We're speaking, David, the morning after an interview between President Trump and Fox News personality Laura Ingraham, in which Trump once again doubled down on his provocations towards Canada, including talk of the country being the 51st state. In the interview, he attributes his hostility to some degree to the personality of Justin Trudeau. Help us understand his evolving relationship with the Mexican president. What is the state of it? How should we understand their personal rapport?
Well, the previous president was a man named previous Mexican president was a man named Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador. And although he and Trump got off to a bumpy start because Lopez Obrador is, again, very much from the nationalist
Yes.
leftist tradition in Mexico. They rapidly got along because they were both kind of bullies. They were both non-respecters of democratic norms. They both thought the president shouldn't have to be bothered by pesky things like the law and the judiciary. Judges should just do what he says. And they were both kind of reactionary in their social opinions. Both male chauvinists, both distrustful of modern medicine. Lopez Obrador famously was very hesitant about getting vaccinated. He, in the end, took the Chinese vax that doesn't work all that well, but mostly he relied on magic amulets to protect him from COVID, which is a step below hydroxychloroquine and the other magic remedies that Trump was recommending.
Yes.
So they actually ended up getting along quite well, and on a personal level. Sheinbaum is a more intellectual person than Lopez Obrador. She's a woman, which is always a problem in Trump's world. He never quite respects women the way he respects fellow cranky reactionary men.
Yes.
But she has been giving him what he wants while talking a tough game. I think people on social media see her speeches. She appears in the Zocalo, the big square in the center of Mexico City, with giant Mexican flags and huge crowds, and she breathes defiance against Trump. But actually, she's doing what he wants. The Canadian position has been to take a softer line in public and a harder line in private. And that's got a lot to recommend it. And Canada has somewhat more bargaining power than Mexico does. But in the end, the two would be stronger together, as difficult as it is, as unnatural in many ways as it is for Canada and Mexico to work together. If the North American relationship is to be preserved as a trilateral relationship,
Yes.
then the other two legs of the stool have to find a way to cooperate.
One more question before we do come to what that type of cooperation might look like. You mentioned the subject of nationalism. That, of course, is a big part of what's occurring here in Canada. We're seeing a rise in a sense of nationalism, what one might even characterize as an anti-Americanism, which, for better or for worse, is ostensibly putting some constraints on the ability of different political leaders to maneuver vis-a-vis the Trump administration. Can you talk a bit about the political context in Mexico?
Yeah. Well, in the same way, Mexico has a very unhappy history with the United States.
Yes.
Obviously, going back for a long time and continuing until very recently. There's much less goodwill in Mexico toward the United States than there is inside Canada. So nationalism is very real. Mexico is a very nationalistic society. But we all need to keep in mind, look, when pushed, it's very natural to respond. When Trump says, America first, we want to annex you, obviously Canadians bristle.
Yes.
And that's just human dignity at work.
Yes.
But it's important to keep in mind what the destination you're trying to get to. The goal is not to meet American chauvinism with Canadian chauvinism, American protectionism with Canadian protectionism, American state-led industrial policy with Canadian state-led industrial policy. The goal is to find some way to get back to the vision of a world that trades in peace and cooperation, to get back to alliances. Now, the Americans may be withdrawing from that world, and then there's nothing anybody can do. But you don't want to let your reaction to American provocations drive you into an unstrategic approach where you forget what your national interests are. Canada needs to be part of trading systems. It's just, Canada makes a lot of stuff that no one else has. No one else has the aluminum. No one else has the nickel. The Canadians also appreciate fresh fruits and vegetables.
Yes.
And Canadians need to drink orange juice to get their vitamin C. Those things are not going to be grown indigenously in Canada. And Canada, even more seriously, can never provide the capital that Canada needs to develop this extraordinary natural landscape. Canada will always be a capital importing country. And the United States is the obvious place to get the capital that Canada needs to develop its resources.
Yeah, brilliantly said, and thanks for helping to lay the context as we pivot into the inevitable question. If policymakers were listening to your advice and indeed sought to strengthen the Canada-Mexico relationship in the lead up to what seems like an inevitable renegotiation of the USMCA, what might that type of bilateral partnership look like, David?
It begins. We're not quite ready yet. It begins by building institutions.
Yes.
There needs to be a thicker Canadian presence in Mexico, a bigger embassy. Ambassadors there have been some very good ambassadors. I've had the privilege to meet some of them, but consistently ambassadors with deep knowledge of Mexico who aren't pulled off their first choice of working on the China desk or the USA desk. Really, this needs to be developed as a career track with language training. The Mexican elite is not uniformly English speaking. And the English is often less fluent than you might think. Claudia Sheinbaum, her President Lopez Obrador spoke almost no English. And Claudia Sheinbaum, while she speaks some English, she's not fluent in the language and wouldn't want to negotiate in English. So you need to develop an embassy staff who are very comfortable in Spanish. You need to leave them there for a long time. You need to build cultural institutions. You need to welcome the expansion of the Mexican presence in Ottawa. And you just need to develop greater situational awareness of what it is that Mexico wants and needs from Canada. Again, the Mexicans want a bilateral relationship with the United States. It's often hard to get them to understand that Canada can be helpful to them, but it could be. And to develop even the awareness of common interests is the first step toward acting on those common interests.
Yes, I was just going to say, David, one potential impediment to what you've just laid out is the memory of Canadians who rightly or wrongly believe that Mexico, in a way, pulled a fast one on Canada in the last round of trilateral negotiations and essentially pursued its own bilateral arrangement with the United States that Canada then struggled to find its way into. Talk about the risk of Mexico playing off Canada in its own efforts to secure some type of bilateral arrangement with the United States, and how Canadian officials can mitigate against such a risk.
Well, both countries did it. So the debate with the last round of CUSMA USMCA was that both countries wanted to get a bigger share of the automobile industry. The Americans say, we want to take more of it from ourselves. We want to exclude the Chinese. And Canada and Mexico said, right, we'll both cooperate with you, but we also want to advantage ourselves at the expense of the other junior member of the relationship. So the Mexicans proposed various kinds of quantitative barriers. X% of every car must be North American content.
Yes.
And knowing that because Mexico is the low-cost provider, the more of the car is made in North America, the more will be made in Mexico.
Yes.
The Canadians said to the Americans, well, wait a moment, your goal here is to defeat low-wage labor, so we think the deal should be that a certain percentage of the car must be made in factories that pay at least, I'm going to forget the dollar amount, I think it was $15 an hour, but it was set just north of what Mexican factories paid. So we want the trade deal to exclude Mexican products. The Canadians won on what was in writing. The deal was written the way the Canadians wanted, but for reasons I won't pretend to fully understand, it actually worked out much more in the Mexican favor. Mexico's share of the automobile industry in North America has grown over the past half decade. Canada's has tended to shrink. I don't understand exactly how that happened because the deal was written otherwise, but the Mexicans prevailed. And so both countries are mad at the other. Yes. Mexicans feel like, well, you betrayed us, but you didn't get away with it. And the Canadians feel, well, we were scheming to betray you, but it didn't work, and you got what we wanted. And who does that help other than the country at the center, which is right now under this incredibly irresponsible leadership? The Mexico and Canada, if they don't find some way to hang together, they will hang separately.
Yeah. David, one of the reasons why I find your argument here so compelling is because I find far less compelling an argument one finds in Canada these days, which is that Canada ought to be working to diversify its trade flows to Europe or Asia, or there are some who argue in favor of so-called Kansic, what amounts to a return to the old Commonwealth preferential trading system. Mexico, by contrast, is already part of our integrated supply chains. There are transportation links, etc. Why don't you just reflect a bit on the practicalities behind the case for strengthening our relationship with Mexico as opposed to pursuing some of the other things that one hears these days from different Canadian policymakers and analysts?
Well, let's talk about each of them separate. Let's first talk about the Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK plan. Defense planning follows values. Yeah. Trade flows don't. Canada and Australia are never going to be great trading partners because their economies are too similar. Both are natural resource producers. Both are short of the capital. They both are going to be capital importers, and they're very, very far away.
Yes.
And it's just not I defense cooperation, yes. Cultural cooperation, yes. Diplomatic cooperation, yes. But there was a reason why Commonwealth preference fell apart, and the most important reason it fell apart is the whole Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK fantasy depends on the United Kingdom continuing the crazy self-harm of staying out of the European Union.
Yes.
And they will not continue that crazy self-harm forever.
Interesting.
The reason Commonwealth preference fell apart in the 60s was that Britain said, in the end, we're just off the coast of France. We're next to the nearest big city is Hamburg. Of course, we're going to be trading most with our continental partners instead of trying to keep alive a sentimental concept of the empire minus India.
Yes.
India's was what made the empire always make economic sense. Without India, the empire never made economic sense. The European project is a little bit more sensible. You do have the problem of geographic distance. But look, the thing that Europe is going to want from Canada, above all, is energy. And that means Canada has to be willing to take its energy products, not just oil, but also natural gas, and export them and build the transportation infrastructure to move. The thing that Europe needs most is liquefied natural gas. And building that infrastructure is not fast. To turn a natural gas into a liquid, first you have to crush it under great pressure to compress it into a liquid form, and then on the other end you have to uncrush it and turn it back into a gas.
Yes.
The uncrushing can be done relatively quickly and only moderately expensively, hundreds of millions of dollars. But the crushing part takes years and costs billions of dollars. And by the way, there are huge regulatory concerns because if you get the uncrushing part wrong, the gas escapes into the atmosphere and it's just pollution. But if you get the crushing part wrong, you get a giant explosion.
Yeah, David, if you'll permit me, I want to transition our conversation in our remaining moments to focus a bit more on Canada and what to make of some of the dynamics playing out here. First of all, this is the first week that we saw Prime Minister Carney in action. As I mentioned, it seemed notable that his first act as Prime Minister was to travel abroad, not to announce a domestic spending program, which in a way is how we've come to think about Canadian policymaking and politics over the past decade or so. What do you make of his first venture abroad and his first week as Prime Minister?
Well, he's got a very challenging career problem. So Mark Carney spent his career as a chairman of 2 central banks and the CEO of a major corporation. And one thing that happens when in those roles is you don't have to put up with a lot of stuff you don't like. In fact, you have to put up with very little that you don't like. No one is ever mean to a central banker. Everyone is sort of deferential and agreeing with it, laughing at his jokes, agreeing with his observation. And it's hard to put pressure on him. He can put a lot of pressure on you. Ditto with the CEO. Being a politician is a very different kind of job. You have to put up with all kinds of stuff from people that the politician may or may not respect. And so it's a very challenging career pivot he's about to make.
Yes.
And maybe there's a strategy to going to Paris and London first, but maybe it's just those are agreeable places to go, and going to Mexico City would be less agreeable. And when you've spent most of your adult life doing things that are agreeable, it's hard to make the pivot to doing things that are disagreeable. But Bill Clinton wonderfully said that the job of a politician, can I say this on our family radio, is to eat shit and pretend to like it. That's the thing that a Canadian Prime Minister and a President of Mexico are going to be doing a lot. That's what they're paid to do. That's why they get the big house, they get the big plane, is they have to go to Washington and they have to eat shit and they have to pretend to like it. Yes. And if you say, you know what, I don't really like it, I want to go somewhere where I'm going to be treated nicely. Look, I understand that. I understand that preference. That's probably the way I would feel if I were in the job. But it's not what he's paid to do.
Yes. David, I think we are on something approaching the 80th episode or more of these bi-weekly conversations, now weekly, that I've had the privilege to do with you here at the Hub. And one through line has been the extent to which our national politics has shrunk from the responsibilities given to our national government, particularly around international relations, security, and defense. And a part of that, of course, is the preferences of politicians, but a big part of it is the preferences of the Canadian public. We seem poised to have a national election as early as this weekend, where national or international issues rather will loom larger than they've had maybe since 1988. What's your sense, David? Do you think Canadians understand the importance of the Canada-U.S. relationship, of a kind of politics that subordinates transactionalism and actually focuses more on the proper roles and functions of a national government?
Well, you and I have both jointly been very critical of the lack of these kinds of issues in Canadian politics in the past. Yet, there is a kind of logic to it.
Yes.
So Canadians, in the years since World War II, Canada was very active in international affairs in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
And Canadians may have felt, you know what, we got it right. Canadians had a huge role in building NATO. Canada built these global free trade arrangements. Canada was very important in the old general agreement on tariffs and trade that defined trade rules before the year 2000. Canada's been a player, a less one, in the World Trade Organization that succeeded. Of course, there's the U.S.-Canada trade agreement, which was so controversial and now so accepted. There was the entry into NAFTA. And Canadians may have felt, look, our parents and our grandparents got these structures of international security and international trade right. In a world that's dominated by the United States and China and India, how much difference can Canada make, really? Basically, we're satisfied with the deals we've got. So let's just now focus on maximizing our well-being under those deals. And so long as the deals look solid, that was maybe not a crazy way to think. And, Cassandras like you and me might say, well, this may not continue forever. You need to keep up. You need to continue to maintain what was built before. You need to invest in the maintenance. You need to have a military so that your voice carries. But in the context of 2015, that seemed like, yes, of course I should floss every day, but sometimes I'm busy.
Yes.
And there's no immediate harm from the not flossing. It won't catch up with me for some time.
Yes.
And now it's all been brought back. All of those arrangements that were built, in which Canada played such a big part in the 50s, 60s, and later, they're coming unstuck. As you and I speak, there's a story that the Americans are considering no longer nominating a supreme allied commander of the forces in NATO. NATO has always had an American supreme commander, and the Trump people are saying, maybe not. So as NATO dissolves, as World Trade Organizations dissolve, Canada needs security. It cannot provide as much security as it needs. It cannot provide its own trading networks by itself. It has to be part of bigger networks. And Canadians are discovering that the international really does matter in a way that the Canadians of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and later understood it. I wish there was some way to learn these things except through pain, but it seems that pain is the way we learn them.
I think this will be my final question to you, David. Against the dismal backdrop that you just painted, Canada is actually the president of the G7 this year, which itself is celebrating its 50th anniversary. We had foreign ministers here in the country in the last week or 10 days. G7 leaders are scheduled to come to Canada in June. Is there, I don't want to sound naive, but is there an opportunity for Canada to use the G7 presidency to shape a conversation around the lines that you just set out?
Well, one thing that I understand is underway is Canada has vetoed President Trump's wish to return Vladimir Putin to joining the G7. And I understand that, I may be wrong about this, my understanding is there is an invitation to President Zelensky to join the G7. That will create the thing that Donald Trump cares about most, photographs. He is so image conscious. And the sight of Vladimir Zelensky being treated by all his allies as the hero Zelensky is, and Putin not being there and being treated as the pariah and villain that Putin is, that won't change Trump's admiration and affection for Putin and his hatred and contempt and resentment of Zelensky. But it may make him more aware of the costs of indulging his Putin mania and his Zelensky phobia.
I said that was the final question. If I can just slide one more in. Is there anything in the intervening time that Canada should be doing, in your judgment, David, to try to build momentum for a conversation at that G7 focused on precisely what you talked about earlier, either the reaffirmation of those existing pieces of the international architecture, which have been so core to Canada's interests, or possibly the creation of new ones in a world where the U.S. can't be relied upon either to sustain or even acknowledge its commitments under these different international arrangements.
Well, along with reaffirming the Mexico relationship or developing the Mexico relationship, Canada does need to make an effort to reaffirm the Japan relationship. The Japanese have been very clear that Ukraine is important to them too. They are just off the coast of China, just off the coast of Russia. They have a more considerable defense capability than it's considered polite to mention, but they probably are not capable of defending themselves alone against China. They need the American security guarantee that has kept the peace in the Pacific, and Japan has been such a beneficiary of since 1945. Canada's, again, treated the Japan relationship as very much a matter of business. Japanese manufactured exports to Canada, Canadian natural resource exports to Japan. Business is business. There's not much of a strategic framework to it. But again, the Japanese are willing to speak out about the importance of the American role in the Pacific. Canada's a Pacific power too. And that's something that even if you've been governor of Bank of England, you have to remember Canada's interests are not only eastward looking across the Atlantic, but westward looking across the Pacific.
Masterclass, David. All the way around the globe in less than 30 minutes. I want to thank you for joining me. We'll be back in conversation next week, in which we will find ourselves most likely in a federal election campaign. I'm grateful for the time to speak and look forward to catching up next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.